A Marine stood in the freezing dark beside a burning diner, smoke rising into the falling snow as he searched for a man who had just saved his life and then vanished. Hours earlier, he had nothing but a dying truck, a hungry canine, and a past he couldn't outrun. Now, he held a secret left behind by a fallen brother, one powerful enough to bring down a man the entire city trusted. People saw the fire. They saw the chaos. But no one knew the truth unfolding beneath the ice. Then a phone rang, and a voice whispered a choice that would decide who lived, who disappeared, and who would finally face the past. If this story stays with you, don't forget to subscribe, turn on the bell, and stay until the very end. Snow came early over Duluth, and by dusk, the wind off Lake Superior had turned the streets into narrow white corridors, where even the bravest footsteps sounded temporary. Jack Turner sat beneath the rusted awning of a shuttered hardware store, with his back to the brick wall and his boots planted wide, the way men sat when they had learned long ago that comfort was a luxury and exits mattered more. At 35, Jack still had the hard frame of a Marine, broad through the shoulders, tall enough to look imposing even while folded into himself against the cold. But hardship had shaved him down to angles and shadows. His jaw was lean, dark stubble rough across it like a field left untended, and a pale scar cut through one eyebrow, thin as a forgotten promise. His black knit cap was pulled low, but it could not hide the exhaustion in his eyes, a washed-out gray blue that moved constantly, checking the street, the diner window, the passing headlights, never fully resting anywhere. Months ago he had lost his security job at the freight yard after missing too many shifts while trying to care for his mother through the last stretch of her illness. The bills had finished what grief had started. His savings went first, then his apartment, then the pride he had once worn like body armor. Now there was only the old Ford pickup parked 2 blocks away, a gas tank that hovered near empty, and the paper-wrapped half of a cheeseburger cooling in his gloved hand. Beside him lay Ruger, a 7-year-old German shepherd with a thick sable coat, dark along the spine and gold at the throat, his muzzle beginning to silver around the edges in a way that made him look noble rather than old. He had the deep chest and disciplined stillness of a working dog who had spent years learning that the difference between noise and danger mattered. Hunger had sharpened the lines of his ribs under the fur, but it had not taken the alert lift of his ears or the steady amber intelligence in his eyes. Every few seconds he looked at Jack, not pleading, not impatient, just checking, as if he had appointed himself guardian not only of the man's body, but of the parts of him that kept wanting to slip quietly into the dark. Jack peeled back the wrapper, looked at the burger for a long moment, and felt his stomach clench so hard it almost made him laugh. "Lucky you," he murmured, though the joke had no light in it. He broke the burger in 2, then broke his half again, and gave the larger piece to Ruger. The dog did not move until Jack tilted his head once in permission. Only then did he take it, carefully, politely, with the restrained obedience of an animal who had once worked beside gunfire and chaos, and had never forgotten the rules. Jack watched him chew, and told himself the knot in his chest was only hunger. It was not. Hunger was simple. This was the heavier thing, the slow, poisonous whisper that a man could fall far enough that even his own future stopped recognizing him. Across the street, the windows of Carter's Grill glowed gold through the storm. Each time the door opened, warmth spilled out with the scent of coffee, bacon grease, onions on the flat top, and fresh bread, and each time someone came out, they saw him. A bundled couple glanced over and lowered their voices. A delivery driver in a red parka paused just long enough to look at Ruger, then kept going. A teenager in a wool hat stared openly until her mother pulled her away. Jack could not blame any of them. A big man with a military posture and a dog at his side could look noble in daylight and dangerous after dark. And this town knew little about him except what the snow was willing to show. Worn coat, cracked gloves, nowhere to be. Inside the diner, Ben Carter sat alone at the corner booth nearest the window, his coffee untouched long enough to go lukewarm. He was 70 and looked like a man carved from old cedar and weather, narrow-hipped, long-armed, and still straight-backed, despite the ache that winter put in his bones. His face was all ridges and experience, the skin tanned and roughened by decades of wind off the lake, his nose slightly bent from an old break, his chin covered in a close white beard he trimmed with the discipline of a man who no longer had much to control except small things. A plaid flannel shirt showed beneath his brown work coat, and his hands, wrapped around the mug, were square and scarred from 40 years running a grill, hauling crates, repairing what other people threw away. Ben had once been louder, quicker to joke, quicker to anger, too. But grief had filed him down into a quieter shape. His son Luke had died overseas 8 years earlier. And after that, Ben had become the kind of man who spoke less, not because he had nothing to say, but because life had taught him words did not always outmuscle silence. He had the habit of watching people before deciding what they were made of. Tonight he watched the stranger under the awning feed the dog before feeding himself, and something in his chest gave a small, unwilling stir. Behind the counter moved Nora Ellis, the evening manager, 32, tall and spare, with chestnut hair twisted into a loose knot and freckles scattered across a face made serious by long practice. She had a quick, practical kindness about her, the kind born not from innocence, but from surviving hard years without becoming cruel. When she noticed Ben still staring out the window, she followed his gaze. "You know him?" she asked. Ben shook his head. "No." "You planning to adopt another stray?" she said, half teasing. "That depends," Ben answered, pushing himself out of the booth. "On what?" He pulled on his gloves. "On whether he still got enough fight left in him to be insulted by help." The bell over the diner door gave a tired little jangle as Ben stepped into the storm. Jack saw him coming and straightened, instinct snapping awake. Ben moved carefully on the slick sidewalk, but there was nothing hesitant in him. Up close, he smelled faintly of coffee, smoke, and cold air. He stopped a few feet away, looked first at Ruger, then at the wrapper in Jack's hand, then at Jack himself. "Dog's eating better than you," he said. Jack's mouth tightened. He earned it. Ben nodded once, as if that answer had passed some private test. "There's hot stew inside. Can't pay for it. Didn't ask if you could." Jack looked away toward the street, embarrassed by the sudden heat of anger behind his ribs. Pride was a ridiculous thing to guard when a man was sleeping in a truck, but it was often the last rag left on the line. "I'm fine." Ben snorted softly. "Son, the snow on your shoulders says otherwise." For a second, Jack almost refused, just because the old man's tone left no room for dignity. Then the wind shifted hard, driving a sheet of powder across the sidewalk, and Ruger leaned closer to his leg. Jack exhaled. "Just until the squall passes." "That's how most rescues start," Ben muttered, turning toward the diner. Inside, the warmth struck Jack like memory. His fingers ached as they thawed. Nora gave him one long, assessing look, then, without comment, set down a bowl of beef stew, thick with potatoes and carrots, another bowl for Ruger with scraps of plain meat, and a mug of black coffee. Jack murmured thanks, keeping his eyes low. Ruger remained at his knee until Jack touched 2 fingers lightly toward the floor and said, almost under his breath, "Lantern, down." The dog folded instantly onto the tiles, front paws crossed, gaze up and alert. The spoon stopped halfway to Ben Carter's mouth. For one strange second, all sound in the diner seemed to retreat. The scrape of forks, the hiss from the kitchen, the rattle of sleet against the windows. Ben stared at Jack's hand, then at the dog, then at the man's face, as if searching it for an older ghost. Luke had used that same word once, not because it was official, not because any manual had taught it, but because he had joked that a good dog was the lantern that got a Marine through the dark. Ben had not heard that command since the day his son stopped coming home. He said nothing. He only sat back slowly, his weathered face gone still in a way that meant the storm had shifted from the street to somewhere much nearer. And as Jack lowered his eyes to the steaming bowl, unaware of what he had just awakened, Ben Carter began to wonder whether the stranger who had walked in with the snow might have walked out of his dead son's past. Morning arrived hard and colorless over Duluth, the kind of winter dawn that made the whole city look as if it had been sketched in ash and salt. Jack Turner was already outside Carter's grill before the first customer came in, pushing a metal snow shovel across the sidewalk, while the lake wind drove powder against his boots in sharp white bursts. He had slept in his truck again, though Ben Carter had insisted on giving him an old wool blanket and a thermos of coffee before the diner closed. The blanket still held the faint scent of cedar and detergent, household smells that had no right to feel as comforting as they did. Jack hated that he noticed. Comfort was dangerous. It loosened things inside a man. It made him remember what it had felt like to belong somewhere, and memory, he had learned, was often crueler than hunger. Ruger stood near the diner's side entrance, snow collecting lightly on his broad back before he shook it off with disciplined irritation. In daylight, the German shepherd looked more formidable than he had under the night lamps, all long-boned strength, heavy paws, and a coat built for bad weather. At 7, he had slowed just enough to make his movements deliberate rather than restless, but there was still a soldier's precision in the way he watched the alley, the lot, the roofline, and finally Jack. The dog had the patience of an old sergeant, and the eyes of someone who had seen too much and chosen loyalty anyway. Inside, Nora Ellis unlocked the back door with one hand, while balancing a carton of eggs against her hip. Up close in the morning light, she looked even more tired than she had the night before, though not fragile. She was the kind of woman who had learned to function while exhausted and keep moving without asking the world for permission. Her skin was pale from winter, freckled across the nose and cheeks, and her chestnut hair had been twisted into a hurried knot that was already coming loose. "You're early," she said. Jack leaned the shovel against the wall. "Couldn't sleep." Nora's mouth tilted in a humorless half-smile. "That makes 3 of us. Ben's been up since 4, pretending not to worry about inventory." She stepped aside to let Ruger in. The dog paused, glanced at Jack for permission, then padded across the threshold like a quiet sentry entering familiar ground. Ben Carter was in the kitchen, wrestling with the stubborn hinge of the walk-in cooler when Jack found him. In daylight, the old man seemed narrower, but not weaker. His age showed in the stiffness of his shoulders and the slow care with which he bent. Yet his hands were still sure, square-palmed, knuckled thick from years of labor. He wore the same brown work coat and plaid flannel, and his beard had been combed into neat order, as if discipline were the fence he kept rebuilding against grief. "You know how to use a wrench? Or am I about to regret feeding you?" he asked, without turning. "I know which end hurts when you hold it wrong. That almost counts." Jack took the wrench from him, crouched by the hinge, and set to work. The metal was warped from old cold and older neglect. But the problem was simple enough. He preferred simple things. Hinges made sense. Loose bolts made sense. Things either fit or they didn't. People were harder. Ben watched him for a moment before grunting and walking away, which Jack had already learned was the old man's version of trust. The day unfolded in small, practical tasks. Jack hauled produce boxes from the delivery truck, salted the back steps, scraped frozen slush from the loading area, and reorganized a leaning shelf in the pantry before it could collapse on someone. He worked the way he had once moved through supply tents overseas, efficiently, quietly, with no energy wasted on conversation. The regular breakfast crowd took notice in the sideways way small-town people always did. A trucker in a faded packer's cap nodded at him over coffee. An elderly woman in a purple scarf left half a strip of bacon under the table for Ruger, until Nora politely stopped her. No one asked questions yet. Jack was grateful for that. Questions were doors, and lately every door inside him opened onto something broken. Still, something about the rhythm of the diner unsettled him more than silence would have. Orders called out from the grill, mugs clinking, the smell of grease and onion and coffee, Nora sliding plates across the counter with brisk competence, Ben muttering at the register. It all stirred an old ache Jack could not quite name. Maybe it was because places like this still believed in repetition. Open, serve, clean, close, begin again. A man could build a life in those cycles if he trusted them enough. Jack was no longer sure he trusted anything that promised tomorrow. By late afternoon, the storm had thinned to a gray drift, and Ben told him to come around back after close. Jack almost refused out of reflex, but the old man's tone made it sound less like an invitation than an item on a work order. The house behind the diner was small and square, attached by a narrow covered passage where the wind moaned through the boards. Inside, it was warmer than Jack expected. Not polished, not delicate, just lived in. The furniture was old but repaired, the lamps dim and steady, the floor scarred by decades of boots. It felt like the kind of house that had survived because someone insisted on mending what age tried to take. Ben pointed to a hall closet. "Take a coat that fits, and there are extra blankets on the top shelf." Jack opened the closet, then stopped. On the wall above a narrow side table stood a framed photograph of a young Marine in desert utilities, one hand braced on the shoulder of a German shepherd. The resemblance hit before thought did. Luke Carter had Ben's cheekbones, the same stubborn jaw, the same steady, unreadable eyes, only younger and less weathered, with sun-browned skin and a grin that looked half amused by the world and half ready to challenge it. The dog beside him was leaner than Ruger, narrower through the head, but the pose, the closeness, the ease between man and animal reached into Jack like a hand closing around an old bruise. "You knew him," Ben said from behind him. It was not a question. Jack did not turn at first. His throat had gone tight. "Yeah." The word came out thinner than he intended. Silence expanded between them, full of old ghosts. When Jack finally looked back, Ben had not moved. The old man's face was calm, but too calm, the way lakes looked just before the ice shifted. "How?" Jack rubbed a hand over his mouth. "Same unit, different rotations at first, then the same one." Ben waited. Jack glanced at Ruger, who had settled near the table with his head up, watching both men as if he knew the room had changed. Luke trained with him, Jack said quietly. After... He stopped, then forced himself onward. After Luke was killed, Ruger was transferred out. I took him. Ben's eyes flickered once toward the dog. That was the only sign the words had landed like shrapnel. He crossed the room slowly and opened a drawer in the side table. From it, he pulled a knitted wool cap, cream-colored once, now softened by wear and faintly frayed near the seam. "My granddaughter's," he said. "Mia." He handed it over, and Jack saw, tucked in the fold, a long strand of dark auburn hair. Ben's voice lowered, roughened not by anger but by fear worn too long. "She's been gone 11 days. Police think 17-year-old girls leave home because they're angry or stupid or both. Mia's not stupid." He looked toward the back window where the last of daylight had turned the snow blue. 2 nights ago, I found footprints outside the rear porch. Small boots. Stopped by the steps. Turned away again, like she came close and lost her nerve. Jack stared at him. "You didn't say that before." "I didn't say a lot of things before." Ben held out the cap toward Ruger. "Can your dog tell me whether I've gone old and crazy?" Jack hesitated only a second before crouching and letting Ruger smell the knit wool. The dog inhaled once, then again, deeper this time, his whole posture changing. His ears rose. The muscles along his shoulders tightened. He looked not confused, not merely interested, but engaged, the way he did when a scent became a trail, and a trail became purpose. Then he turned sharply toward the back door and let out a low, urgent whine. Jack felt the hair lift at the back of his neck. Ben said nothing, but when Jack looked at him, the old man's face had gone pale beneath the weathered skin. Somewhere beyond the little house, beyond the diner and the darkening alley and the streets filling once more with snow, something invisible had just stepped out of rumor and into fact. Mia Carter had been close. Close enough to touch the porch, close enough to leave fear in the snow, and recent enough that Ruger still knew she was out there. By sunrise, the city had become a map of half-erased tracks, alleys gone pale under fresh snow, rooftops wearing drifts like old men wore silence, and the harbor breathing its iron-cold breath over everything that tried to stay alive. Jack Turner left Ben Carter's house just after first light, with Ruger at his side and a pair of borrowed gloves tucked into his coat pocket. He had agreed to help for the day, and only for the day. But the words had felt thin even when he said them. Men who had spent enough years in uniform learned to recognize false bargains with themselves. He knew already this search would not let him go cleanly. Ben followed 2 steps behind, slower on the icy walkway, but stubbornly refusing the offer to stay back. In the gray morning, the old man looked more worn than he allowed anyone to see inside the diner. His face had the weathered, split-grain look of timber, left too many winters in the wind, and the skin around his eyes seemed almost translucent with fatigue. Fear had thinned him overnight. It had turned his mouth flatter, his movements sharper, as if worry were a file running itself over bone. Jack could see the effort it cost him not to speak Mia's name every other minute. Ruger began at the rear porch, where the small boot prints had faded under the fresh dusting. The dog lowered his head, inhaled slowly, then moved with a deliberate pull toward the alley beyond the diner. Jack let the leash slide through his gloved hand with practiced looseness, enough freedom for Ruger to work, not enough to lose control if the dog surged. They passed dented trash bins, a frozen chain-link fence, and the back wall of a closed laundromat where old flyers flapped like tired prayer flags. The trail led north toward an abandoned bus depot near the edge of the harbor district. She used to cut through here after school, Ben said quietly, as though memory itself might help. Said it made her feel like she was getting away with something. Jack glanced at him. What kind of kid was she? Ben rubbed at his beard, thinking. Too smart to be easy. Too soft-hearted to be safe. 17, and convinced she had to carry other people's hurt like it was rent. He gave a brittle exhale that almost became a laugh. Her mother died when Mia was 10. After that, she started collecting strays. Cats, broken radios, people no one else wanted to deal with. She thought everything could be fixed if you didn't leave it alone too long. That answer stayed with Jack. It sounded like the kind of goodness that could get a person killed if it walked into the wrong, dark room. At the depot, Ruger circled a boarded ticket window and pulled them past a graffitied bench buried in snow. Beneath the steel awning, Jack found cigarette ends, fresh tire tracks, and the heel marks of more than one person slipping on ice. None of it meant enough by itself. Too many lives brushed the edges of places like this. Then Ruger lifted his head and turned toward the waterfront with sudden certainty. The dog's ears came forward, every line of him tightening into purpose. Jack felt that change like current through a wire. They moved fast now, down a salt-stained service road and across a chain barrier someone had left unlatched. The harbor opened ahead in a sweep of dull steel water and frozen pilings. Cargo cranes rising against the morning like giant skeletal birds. Pier 3 sat farther out than the others, half shut down for repairs, its access road lined with warehouses and rusted trailers. The place had the dead quiet of somewhere useful things had once happened, and ugly things might still. At the foot of the pier, near a drifted retaining wall, Ruger stopped so abruptly Jack nearly walked into him. The dog pawed once at a patch of snow beside a concrete support. Jack knelt and brushed the powder aside with both hands until black canvas showed through. It was a backpack, damp around the seams, one shoulder strap torn. Ben made a sound in his throat that did not belong to language. Jack unzipped the front pouch first. Inside was an inhaler, blue plastic, scratched at the cap. "Asthma?" he asked. Ben nodded at once. "Since she was little." Jack's jaw tightened. He opened the main compartment. A dead phone. A spiral notebook, swollen from melted snow. A pair of knit gloves. At the bottom, folded twice and shoved into the corner as if hidden in a hurry, was a scrap of receipt paper with hurried writing pressed so hard the pen had nearly torn through. Jack unfolded it carefully. The message was short enough to feel like a blow. "Don't trust Caleb." Ben stared at the words and seemed, for a second, not to understand them. Then all the color drained from his face. Caleb Price was his sister's grandson, 29 years old, broad-shouldered, good-looking in the careless way some men were, with sandy hair that always needed cutting, and a trimmed beard that tried to make him look steadier than he was. He had been around the diner for 2 years, delivering produce, fixing loose pipes, carrying crates without being asked. Friendly with customers, quick with a smile, always ready to call Ben Uncle Ben, though the blood between them ran thin and sideways through the family tree. He had also grown up rough. His father drank. His mother disappeared for seasons at a time. And by 16, Caleb had learned charm because he could not rely on much else. Ben had taken pity on him long before he trusted him. Jack read the note again. Not call Caleb. Not help me. Don't trust Caleb. "How often has he been around here lately?" Jack asked. "Almost every day," Ben said, voice gone hollow. "He had a key to the storage cage. He ran groceries when I couldn't get away. The rest caught in his throat. Jack stood, already pulling out his phone, No signal bars at first, then one weak line flickering to life. He called 911, gave the location, explained there was a missing minor, possible trafficking, possible involvement by someone known to the family. The dispatcher's voice remained professional, but the storm and distance dragged every response into delay. Units were tied up across the city by weather collisions and power outages. Someone would come. Jack ended the call without feeling reassured. "Police are on the way," he said, "but not fast." Ben looked toward the warehouses, all those metal-sided giants crouched in the cold. "What do we do?" Jack clipped the backpack shut and handed it to him. "We don't blunder in. We keep moving the edge and see what Ruger finds." The next hour stretched like wire. They worked the perimeter road on foot, using trailers, stacked pallets, and concrete barriers for cover. Ruger moved in short, controlled bursts, nose high now, tracking more than 1 cent. Around midday, they found fresh wheel ruts near Warehouse 9, though the building had a city seal on the side door and was supposed to be inactive. By late afternoon, the sky had begun dimming again, turning the harbor into a world of blue shadow and sodium light. Jack and Ben crouched behind a rusted forklift 50 yards from the warehouse when the side loading door rolled halfway open. 2 men emerged first. One was tall and raw-boned, wearing a yellow dock jacket stretched across narrow hips and a black knit mask pushed up above a sharp, fox-like face. The other was shorter and thicker through the chest, head shaved, movements impatient. They did not look like casual thieves. They looked like men used to handling fear in other people. A white panel van backed toward the loading bay with its lights off. Then Jack saw them. 2 girls. One was slight, wrapped in a dark coat too thin for the weather. Her wrists gripped hard enough by the tall man to make even distance look cruel. The other stumbled behind, younger maybe, hair hanging over her face, one sneaker half unlaced. Neither girl moved like someone being escorted. They moved like people who had learned resistance came with a cost. Ben gripped Jack's sleeve so hard his fingers shook. "That's her," he whispered, voice breaking around the words. "That's Mia." Jack narrowed his eyes, pulse turning heavy and cold in his ears. He had expected danger. He had not expected proof to step into view before sunset like a door swinging open on hell. And as the 2 men started forcing both girls toward the van, Jack understood with a clarity that felt like ice under the ribs that Mia Carter was not alone, and whatever was happening inside Warehouse 9 was about to vanish into the night. The harbor darkened fast, as if evening had been waiting just offshore for permission to come ashore and bury the piers under one more layer of cold. Jack Turner watched the white van inch backward toward the loading bay of Warehouse 9 and felt time contract into something hard and brutal. Beside him, behind the rusted forklift, Ben Carter had gone so still he looked carved from the same frozen metal around them. The old man's breath came shallow through his nose, every exhale shaking with the effort not to panic. Jack could hear it, could feel it, and knew that if he let Ben follow him any farther, fear and love together would get them both killed. He pulled out his phone and dialed 911 again, forcing his voice low and flat as he gave the exact warehouse number, the side entrance, the white van, the 2 girls, the 2 men. The dispatcher kept asking him to stay clear and wait for officers. Jack looked at the loading bay, at the thin girl who had to be Mia bending under a rough hand, and knew that wait was a word built for safer lives. "They're moving them now," he said, then ended the call before anyone could chain him to helplessness. He turned to Ben. "Stay here. If they come out before I do, wave the cops to the side door. Don't be brave." Ben's lined face tightened with something older than defiance. At 70, he had the stubborn dignity of men who survived by refusing to bend in public. But grief had already hollowed enough of him that Jack could see the terror shining through. "Bring her back," he said, not as an order, but as the naked plea of a man who had lost once and would not survive losing twice. Jack nodded once and moved. Ruger came with him in silence, the German shepherd low and fluid beside his leg, each stride controlled, each breath measured. Snow hissed across the concrete as they cut toward the side wall of the warehouse. Up close, the building smelled of rust, diesel, salt, and old rot, like commerce left out too long and turned feral. The side door hung crooked on a damaged latch, city warning tape fluttering from one hinge. Jack eased it open just wide enough to slip through. Inside, the air changed at once, warmer than outside, but fouled by oil, mildew, wet cardboard, and the sour human smell of fear. Darkness pooled between stacks of shrink-wrapped pallets and dented steel shelving. Somewhere deeper in the building came the scrape of a boot, a low curse, then the metallic slam of a chain dragged over concrete. Jack crouched, one hand brushing Ruger's shoulder, guiding him through hand signals more than words. The old instincts rose in him as naturally as breath. Clear the corner, mark the exits, count the sounds, identify the nearest cover. He hated how alive it made him feel. War had taken enough from him that he had no right to miss the terrible competence it had once given him. A narrow strip of light spilled from an office cage built above the warehouse floor. Jack spotted one of the men below it, the shorter one he had seen outside. Up close, the man was thick through the neck and shoulders, with a shaved scalp and a broken nose set badly enough to slant his face into a permanent sneer. He moved with impatient violence, the manner of someone who had learned as a boy that force worked faster than speech, and had never bothered developing anything finer. He was fumbling with a ring of keys while glancing toward the bay, muttering at someone upstairs. Another voice answered, sharper and thinner, the tall man in the yellow dock jacket. Jack followed the sound and saw the office cage door above. Through the wired glass, he caught a glimpse of two figures inside, one sitting, one half standing, both with their hands bound in front. Mia, he guessed, and the second girl. No clean shot, no easy path. Only the kind of choice that punished hesitation harder than mistakes. Then the shaved man cursed again and started up the stairs with the keys. Jack moved. He released Ruger on a silent command. The dog launched like a shadow-given muscle, hitting the man low and sideways just as he reached the third step. The keys clattered. The man went down with a strangled shout, arms flailing as Ruger locked onto the heavy sleeve of his jacket and dragged him backward onto the landing. Jack covered the distance in 3 strides, drove a forearm across the man's throat, and slammed his wrist against the metal rail until the knife dropped from his hand. "Quiet," Jack hissed, though the warning was absurd now. Upstairs, the tall man shouted, then the office door banged open. He was younger than Jack expected, maybe early 30s, long-faced and hollow-cheeked, with a patchy beard and quick, nervous eyes that darted too much to ever be honest. He grabbed Mia by the arm and yanked her forward as if she were a duffel bag. The second girl stumbled behind them. She looked 16 at most, small and underfed, with dark skin gone gray under fear, black curls tangled around her face, and a split lower lip. Mia twisted hard enough to nearly fall, and in that brief movement, Jack saw her clearly for the first time. Auburn hair matted under a knit cap, coat hanging loose off weight she had lost, chin set in a brave, furious line that looked achingly like Ben's. "Let her go," Jack said, climbing 2 steps at a time. The tall man shoved Mia toward him and bolted for the catwalk. Jack almost went after him on instinct, but the second girl was collapsing, and Mia was trying to catch her with bound hands. He stopped chasing. Saving was the mission. Revenge was a luxury for later. He cut the zip ties from Mia first, then the other girls. "Can you walk?" he asked. Mia nodded too fast. The other girl whispered, "I think so," though her knees said otherwise. Jack handed Mia the fallen ring of keys. "Find the nearest door. Stay behind me. Keep hold of her." They had nearly reached the side exit when sirens began to bleed through the walls, thin at first, then rising. Outside, red and blue light spilled across the snow in shattered color. Ben appeared in the doorway like a man pulled there by prayer alone. Mia made a broken sound and ran to him, and the old man caught her with both arms, folding around her as if trying to gather all the missing days back into his chest. For one brief second, the whole night seemed to stop and hold that reunion up like a lantern against the dark. Then the spell broke. Officers swarmed the loading area, weapons up, voices sharp, securing the girls, calling for medics, shouting for anyone still inside to show hands. A woman in a heavy police parka approached Jack fast, one gloved hand lifted in command. She was broad-shouldered, in her mid-40s, with bronze skin flushed red from the cold, and black hair braided tight beneath her cap. Her features were strong and square, her gaze alert without cruelty. The badge on her chest read, "Sergeant Lena Morales." She had the clipped authority of someone who had worked too many winters and too many bad scenes to waste motion. "You Jack Turner?" she asked. "Yes." "Step away from the dog and keep your hands where I can see them." Jack did as told. Ruger stayed at heel, body tight but disciplined. Morales listened to a younger officer jog up beside her, breath fogging in panicked bursts. The officer leaned close and murmured something. Jack caught only fragments: anonymous tip, armed subject, truck on the South Access Road. Morales's face changed almost imperceptibly, not to suspicion exactly, but to the harder mask of procedure. "Your pickup," she said. "Blue Ford, near the service gate?" Jack felt the first cold drop of dread slide beneath his ribs. "Yeah?" "It's being held pending search." "Search for what?" Morales studied him a moment too long. Across the lot, Ben was still holding Mia while paramedics wrapped blankets around both girls. It should have felt like victory. Instead, the night tilted. Another officer shouted from near the road where Jack's truck sat under rotating police lights, his voice carrying clear in the frozen air. There was no mistaking the words this time. Narcotics in the vehicle, and a handgun with the serial number filed off. Jack turned toward the sound, as if the ground itself had lied to him. By the time he looked back, Sergeant Morales was already signaling 2 officers forward, and the man who had gone into Warehouse 9 to save a missing girl had become, in the same breathless night, a suspect standing under the snow. The holding room smelled of disinfectant, wet wool, and the particular kind of stale air that seemed designed to flatten a man into whatever version of himself the state found easiest to process. Jack Turner sat alone at a steel table bolted to the floor, his wrists uncuffed now, but still ringed with the phantom pressure of restraint. His coat had been taken, his boots left damp from the melted snow, and the fluorescent light above him hummed with the thin, mechanical patience of something that had watched hundreds of bad nights pass without caring which men broke beneath it. He was exhausted enough for the room to blur at the edges, but not enough to sleep. Sleep had always been treacherous terrain. It invited the past in wearing familiar boots, Somewhere beyond the cinder block walls, phones rang, radios crackled, doors opened and shut. The system moved on around him, while his life held still in one frozen second. Mia alive. Ruger handed over temporarily to animal control for holding. Narcotics in his truck. A filed-off gun he had never seen before. And every instinct in his body shouting that someone had not only set him up, but done it with the kind of planning that assumed he was already broken enough not to fight back. He lowered his head and tried not to picture Ruger behind a kennel door. The dog had tolerated worse places, worse noise, worse men. But Jack hated the thought of him waiting without understanding. Then again, perhaps Ruger understood more than anyone else ever had. Perhaps that was part of the burden of being loved by a creature that saw too much. The door opened, and Sergeant Lena Morales stepped inside first. In the hard station light, she looked even more formidable than she had at the harbor, solidly built, her dark braid now damp with melting snow, her bronze face drawn by fatigue rather than doubt. There was nothing careless in her. She had the bearing of someone who had been a patrol officer too long to romanticize guilt or innocence, and had learned that truth usually arrived wearing the wrong coat. "You've got 10 minutes, she said, then stepped aside. Ben Carter came in slowly behind her. The old man looked as though the last 12 hours had taken a knife to him. His coat was still dusted with salt from the street, his beard untrimmed now, his shoulders carrying not just age, but the weight of gratitude and shame colliding in the same body. Mia was safe because of Jack. Jack was sitting in a station house because of whoever had moved first in the dark. Ben did not say any of that. He closed the door behind him, crossed the room, and took the chair opposite. For a moment, neither man spoke. The silence between them was not empty. It was crowded with Luke. "I saw Mia," Ben said at last, voice roughened by too little sleep. "They're keeping her at St. Luke's for observation. Mild hypothermia, bruising. They say she'll be all right." Jack let out a breath so slowly, it felt like something being unknotted by hand. "Good." Ben studied him across the table. "That all you've got?" Jack lifted one shoulder. "It's enough." Ben's eyes narrowed, not in anger, but in recognition. He had known too many men of Jack's kind, those who treated relief like contraband because showing it felt too much like begging fate to notice. "No," Ben said quietly. "It isn't." Jack looked away. The concrete wall to his right had a crack running through the paint in the shape of a river. He fixed his gaze on that instead of the old man's face. "Why'd you come?" Ben's answer came without hesitation. "Because I know what it looks like when a man starts burying himself before the ground's even open." That struck harder than accusation would have. Jack rubbed both hands over his face, palms dragging down the stubble and the exhaustion, and for a second he considered lying again, not with words, but with the old military trick of giving just enough truth to protect the wound beneath it. But something in Ben's presence made that impossible. Maybe it was Luke's eyes looking back from his father's face. Maybe it was the knowledge that a girl had been saved tonight, and that should have meant something purer than this. "I slowed him down," Jack said. The sentence came so softly Ben had to lean forward to catch it. "Afghanistan. Helmand Province. We were clearing a compound line after dusk. Dust storm coming in. Visibility bad. I saw movement where there wasn't any. Froze half a second trying to confirm whether it was a weapon or a kid." His throat tightened, but he forced the words through. It was enough. Enough for Luke to turn around and come back for me. Enough for the blast to catch him instead. Ben did not move. Jack laughed once, a dry and joyless sound. People say things cleanly when they tell war stories. Heroic, fast, noble. Truth is uglier. I made a slow decision. Luke paid for it. That's the whole thing. The fluorescent light hummed. Somewhere in the hall, a copier started up. Jack kept going because stopping would have meant breathing, and breathing felt too much like permission. When Ruger got transferred stateside, I took him because it was the only thing that felt even close to carrying part of Luke home. After that, I kept telling myself I'd get my life together enough to deserve still having him, still being the one who walked away. But every year I got worse at it. He finally looked at Ben. So there's your truth. I didn't kill your son on purpose. I just wasn't fast enough. Pain moved over Ben's face like weather crossing old land, slow and unmistakable. For several seconds, Jack thought the old man might stand up and leave. Instead, Ben folded his work-rough hands on the table. "You think I haven't spent 8 years inventing alternate endings?" he asked. "You think I don't know what it means to wake up and bargain with ghosts?" His mouth shook once before he mastered it. Luke made a choice. A Marine's choice, maybe a foolish one, maybe a brave one, but his. If you keep dying for it every day after, then all you're doing is making the grave bigger. Jack held his gaze, stunned not by forgiveness exactly, but by the refusal of blame. Ben leaned back, breath unsteady. "You don't get to join my son in the ground just because guilt has better manners than a bullet." Outside the station, Nora Ellis was doing the sort of work no one wrote songs about, and that often mattered more than heroics. She had returned to Carter's Grill after midnight, when the police tape was gone from the service road, and the last customers had stopped calling for updates. The diner was quiet in a bruised, exhausted way. Nora moved through it with her coat still on, cheeks reddened from cold, chestnut hair half fallen from its knot, eyes narrowed in concentration. She had grown up with a father who lost 3 jobs to gambling and 1 to drinking, and because of that, she trusted paper trails more than promises. She trusted timestamps, receipts, duplicated keys, and the things people forgot to hide when they got arrogant. In the back office, she pulled 3 weeks of delivery logs, matched them against invoices, and found the first problem quickly. Produce entries that had no supplier numbers attached. Fuel reimbursements for trips no one remembered authorizing. Crate counts that changed depending on which copy of the sheet you looked at. Caleb had signed for several of them. She moved next to the security feed from the rear lot, scrubbing through grainy black and white footage until her eyes watered. At 7:42 p.m., on the night Jack was taken in, Caleb appeared beside Jack's blue Ford. He wore his usual canvas jacket and knit cap, shoulders hunched against the wind. But instead of heading toward the back door, he paused by the truck, glanced once over both shoulders, then leaned down on the passenger side long enough to do something hidden by the frame. When he straightened, he walked away too quickly for innocence. Nora froze the image, then sat back with the stillness of someone who knew a bad answer was on its way and had chosen to ask anyway. Caleb was one problem. He was never going to be the whole one. She kept digging and found more footage from the harbor approach road, taken from an old municipal traffic camera archived online. A black SUV had appeared near Warehouse 9 on 3 different nights that week, always after dark, always staying less than 20 minutes. On the final frame, she could make out enough of the plate to run a search through a public city registry. The vehicle was assigned to the office of Councilman David Mercer. Everyone in Duluth knew Mercer's face. 50 years old, silver at the temples, strong-jawed, handsome in the scrubbed and camera-ready way of men who had learned to perform sincerity before they ever felt it. He was the public champion of the harbor redevelopment plan and the loudest advocate for a proposed Veterans Resource Center that would, according to every speech he gave, honor sacrifice by building futures. He smiled often, shook hands well, and had the polished warmth of a man who understood that kindness, when rehearsed enough, could pass for character. Nora stared at the frozen image, then at Mercer's campaign photo on the city page, and felt something cold and deliberate settle into place. Caleb had not been freelancing from greed or panic. He had been standing in the shadow of someone respectable enough to make evil look like civic improvement. By the time Jack Turner stepped out of the station, the afternoon had already begun folding itself into another blue-gray winter evening, and the snow along the curb had turned to ridged banks of ice and soot. He had been released, not cleared, which was its own kind of leash. There had not been enough evidence to charge him, only enough to stain his name and make every uniformed glance linger a second too long. Ruger came back to him outside the municipal holding kennels an hour later, led out by a young animal control officer with wind-chapped cheeks and the tired gentleness of someone who had chosen a job that paid badly because she could not stand the idea of leaving frightened creatures to harder hands. The dog moved fast once he saw Jack, not wild, not whining, just urgent, pressing his head into Jack's chest with such force that the breath left him. Jack closed both hands around the thick fur at Ruger's neck and stood there longer than pride would have liked. Some reunions were too honest to survive dignity. By the time he reached Carter's Grill, the diner windows were already glowing against the early dark, and the sight of them struck him harder than expected. A man could spend years telling himself he needed nothing and still feel something come apart inside him at the sight of one warm place that had not fully turned him away. Inside, Nora Ellis was behind the counter with her sleeves rolled to the elbows, her chestnut hair loose now from a day too long for vanity, a pencil tucked above one ear. She looked like a woman who had kept herself vertical on coffee, adrenaline, and indignation. There was a flushed brightness in her face that did not come from comfort. She set down a mug in front of Jack before he asked for it. "You look terrible," she said. Jack sank onto the stool nearest the register. "Good to know some things stay consistent." That earned him the faintest curve of a smile. "Ben's in the back." Her expression sharpened. "He's been waiting on you, and before you ask, yes, I found something." She slid a spiral notebook across the counter, opened to copied times, plate numbers, invoice discrepancies, and Caleb's name, appearing far too often beside unsigned deliveries. On the last page she had written one name in block capitals, as if pressing harder might pin it to the paper. David Mercer. Jack stared at it. Outside, the story of the city, Mercer was the kind of man newspapers loved in winter. Charitable drives, clean speeches, tailored coats at ribbon cuttings, his silver-shot hair always neat, his jaw set in the camera-friendly firmness of practiced concern. He spoke beautifully about veterans, despite never serving, and somehow that had always made donors admire him more. Jack felt a slow chill move through him that had nothing to do with the weather. Men like Mercer built respectability the same way smugglers built false walls, so that whatever mattered most could travel hidden inside. "You're sure?" Jack asked. Nora nodded. "Sure enough to be scared." Her freckles stood out sharply against her pale skin. "The black SUV at the harbor was registered to his office pool. Caleb was near your truck the night you were set up. And if Mercer's really tied to the warehouse, then somebody's cleaning house before that redevelopment deal goes public." Jack closed the notebook. "Where's Ben?" "In the passage behind the kitchen, pacing like an old wolf in a trap." Ben Carter stood with his back to the narrow window that looked over the alley, both hands wrapped around a cup gone cold. The old man had changed clothes since the station visit, but the new flannel and fresh coat did nothing to hide the fact that he had aged in the last 24 hours. Fear did that. So did memory. He looked at Jack, then at Ruger, and something in his weathered face softened before tightening again into decision. "Close the door," he said. Jack did. The covered passage behind the diner smelled faintly of frying oil, cedar, wet boots, and the old, dry heat from pipes that knocked in winter. Ben set the cup aside. "There's one thing I never told the police. Never told Mia. Never told anyone." He drew a breath and let it out slowly. "A month before Luke died, he mailed me a metal box. Didn't say what was in it. Just said if anyone came asking, I was not to open it, not to hand it over, not unless I was certain the right man was standing in front of me." Jack felt every muscle in his back go still. "You still have it?" Ben nodded. "I kept it, because it was the last thing he ever sent home. At first it was grief. After a while, it was fear." His eyes moved briefly toward the diner wall. Beyond it, the town, the harbor, the deepening dark. "I think Luke saw something over there before he died. Something tied to shipments, maybe names, maybe routes. If Mercer's sniffing around old harbor records, and Caleb's suddenly playing errand boy for monsters, then maybe whatever's in that box matters more now than it did then." Jack understood all at once, with the terrible clarity of puzzle pieces snapping together. Luke had not just died in war and vanished into medals and folded flags. He might have left behind a splinter under the skin of something still living. "Where is it?" Jack asked. Ben's mouth flattened. "Not here. Hidden." Before he could say more, Nora's voice cut through the passage, sharp enough to freeze both men. "Ben?" The first sound Jack heard was not glass breaking, but a dull, hungry thump from the front dining room, followed by the sudden metallic cough of flame taking hold where it had no right to be. Then came Nora again, closer now, one word stripped down to pure alarm. "Fire!" Jack was already moving. He hit the kitchen at a run, Ruger tight behind him. Orange light leaped wild and unnatural across the ceiling tiles. The front curtains were burning first, flame climbing them in fast red tongues. But somebody had helped it along. He could smell accelerant beneath the grease and smoke, sharp and chemical, ugly as intent. One of the booths near the window had already caught. Heat punched through the room so quickly it felt planned by someone who knew exactly where to feed it. Nora stood near the coffee station, coughing hard, one sleeve blackened where she had tried to smother sparks with a dish towel. Jack grabbed her by the arm. "Back exit," he shouted. She shook her head, eyes streaming. "Ben was right behind me." Another pane burst inward, spraying glittering shards across the floor. Ruger barked once, deep and commanding. Jack shoved Nora toward the kitchen door and went low through the smoke, scanning between tables, the way training taught a body to move even when the mind was busy imagining the worst. He found no Ben, only the overturned chair near the register, the till drawer open, the front entrance banging uselessly in the wind. Outside, snow whirled through firelight, like ashes trying to become winter again. Jack got Nora clear. Sirens rose somewhere down the street. People were shouting. Water would come. Hoses, axes, steam, all the machinery of late mercy. But before any of it arrived, Jack knew something colder than fear. This was not only arson. It was interruption. They stood in the alley while firefighters attacked the blaze from both sides, Carter's grill glowing through the smoke like a wound split open in the night. Nora bent over with her hands on her knees, coughing, while Ruger paced tight circles and kept looking toward the dark street beyond the spray. Jack turned once, twice, searching for Ben among the figures gathering in flashing light, but the old man was nowhere. Then Jack's phone vibrated in his pocket. An unknown number. He answered at once. For a second there was only breath and the distant sound of wind. Then Caleb spoke. His voice, usually easy and quick with borrowed charm, had been scraped raw by panic. "If you want Ben alive," he said, "bring the metal box to the abandoned tug at the east dock. Alone." The line went dead, and the fire kept burning. The wind off Lake Superior cut sharper that night, dragging snow across the east dock in thin white sheets that hissed against rusted metal and frozen ropes, as if the harbor itself were whispering warnings no one living could translate in time. Jack Turner did not slow as he crossed the dark stretch between the burned-out glow of Carter's grill behind him and the skeletal outline of the abandoned tugboat ahead. The world had narrowed to one line: find the box, reach the dock, bring Ben back alive. Everything else, the charges waiting in some future courtroom, the weight of Luke's memory, even the question of whether he would walk away from this, had fallen away like snow off a roof. Only purpose remained, cold and absolute. Ben had not told him where the box was in the passage, but Jack had seen the old training crate in the garage more than once, a heavy, scuffed wooden box, reinforced with metal brackets, the kind used to transport working dogs between bases. It still carried Ruger's scent, layered with oil, dust, and time. When Jack pried open the false panel beneath its base, the metal case inside was smaller than he expected, dull gray, military issue, with a latch designed to survive being dropped, kicked, or buried. He had not opened it there. Some things demanded a place and a moment, and the alley behind a half-burned diner did not deserve what might live inside that box. Now, standing 100 yards from the tug, he flipped the latch. Inside lay a USB drive, a thin stack of memory cards, and a folded strip of weathered paper with Luke's handwriting, blocky and impatient, as if written in a hurry between orders. Jack did not read the note first. He slid the drive into his phone, ignoring the cold biting into his fingers. The files opened with a quiet finality that felt heavier than any gunshot. Video. Grainy, but clear enough. Shipping containers at night. Dock numbers. Men loading crates that were never logged. Then faces. Caleb, younger, nervous even then. Others Jack did not know. And finally, stepping into the frame with a smile that did not belong in that kind of darkness, David Mercer. He was dressed differently here. No tailored coat, no public warmth. Just a man with sharp eyes and a controlled impatience, gesturing at cargo as if it were nothing more than numbers on a page. The truth settled like ice in Jack's chest. Luke had not died with empty hands. He had died carrying proof. Jack handed the drive to Nora before he left. She stood in the alley beside the ruined diner, face pale but steady, eyes burning with a quiet resolve that made her look older than her 32 years. "I'll send it everywhere," she said. "FBI, state police, anyone who still remembers what the word duty means." There was something fierce in her voice now, something that had replaced the careful restraint she wore in the diner. This was what happened when ordinary people decided fear was no longer enough to keep them still. Jack nodded once, then turned away before he could think too hard about what might happen if the signal failed, or the wrong person answered first. The tugboat loomed larger as he approached, its hull scarred and flaking, name half erased by rust and neglect. It sat chained to the dock, like an animal too old to run, but too dangerous to release. The deck lights were dead, but a faint glow seeped from the cabin. Ruger moved ahead, low and silent, his body a line of coiled muscle and memory. Jack followed, boots finding the metal steps without hesitation. The door to the cabin stood ajar. Inside, the air was warmer, thick with diesel and stale smoke. Ben Carter sat tied to a metal chair, wrists bound, his head bowed, but his breathing steady. He looked up as Jack entered, and for a second the old man's face softened with something like relief before hardening again into warning. "You shouldn't have come alone," he said. "I didn't," Jack replied quietly, resting a hand on Ruger's shoulder. From the shadows stepped David Mercer. Up close, without cameras or clean lighting, he looked less like a statesman and more like what he truly was, a man who had learned to wear civility the way others wore uniforms. His hair was still neatly cut, silver at the temples, his posture straight, but the smile he gave Jack was thin and humorless. "Mr. Turner," he said, "I had hoped you'd understand the value of cooperation by now." Behind him, Caleb stood near the wall, hands shaking slightly, his face drawn and hollow, as if the boy he had once been was finally visible beneath the man he had pretended to be. "I didn't think it would go this far," Caleb muttered, not quite looking at anyone. "I just needed money. I was going to stop." Mercer did not turn toward him. "People like you always say that," he said softly. "Stopping is a luxury you earn before you begin, not after." Jack held up the metal box. "This is what you want." Mercer's eyes flicked to it, sharp and calculating. "What I want," he said, "is for that to be the only copy." Jack's expression did not change. "It isn't." For the first time, Mercer's composure cracked, just slightly. His hand moved, drawing a compact handgun with the smooth ease of someone who had done it before. "Then we have a problem," he said. The moment stretched. Snow tapped faintly against the cabin windows. Ben shifted in the chair. Caleb's breath came too fast. And then Ruger moved. The dog launched forward with silent precision, hitting Mercer's arm just as the gun came level. The shot cracked wide, slamming into the metal wall behind Jack. Jack closed the distance in 2 steps, driving Mercer backward into the table, the weapon skidding across the floor. Caleb froze, then dropped to his knees, hands raised as if surrendering to something larger than law. Outside, engines roared, doors slammed. Voices cut through the night, sharp, coordinated, undeniable. Federal agents flooded the deck, weapons drawn, boots pounding metal. Nora had kept her word. It ended quickly after that. Mercer was cuffed, his calm gone entirely now, replaced by a brittle rage that made him look smaller. Caleb spoke without being asked, words spilling out in a rush, how it had started small, moving unlogged goods, then people, then debts he could not pay except by going deeper. Mia and the others had been targets of opportunity, runaways or almost runaways, girls no one would look for quickly enough. He cried when he said it, but the tears came too late to matter. Weeks later, Carter's Grill stood under scaffolding, its windows replaced, its walls scrubbed clean of smoke. The burn marks were still there, if you knew where to look. Faint shadows beneath fresh paint, reminders that some things did not vanish entirely. Jack no longer slept in his truck. He worked mornings now at the port's K-9 training unit, not yet permanent, but steady enough to feel like ground instead of ice. Ruger moved beside him with renewed purpose, the old discipline returning not as burden, but as belonging. Ben stood one afternoon in the half-finished diner, a small metal tag resting in his palm. Luke's dog tag. He pressed it into Jack's hand. "My son is gone," he said quietly. "That's already been paid for. Don't pay it again." Jack did not answer. He closed his fingers around the tag, then reached down to rest his hand on Ruger's head. Outside, Lake Superior lay frozen to the horizon, a vast sheet of white silence. But beneath that ice, unseen and unstoppable, the water had already begun to move. At the quiet edge of this story, where snow softens the scars of fire and loss, a gentle truth remains. Miracles rarely arrive with thunder. They come in small, human choices. An old man who refuses to walk away, a broken soul who chooses to stand again, a loyal dog who reminds a heart how to trust. Perhaps God does not always part seas or move mountains, but He places people in our path at the exact moment we need saving, and asks us to do the same for others. In your daily life, someone near you may be carrying a hidden storm. A kind word, a moment of patience, or simply staying when others leave can become someone's miracle. If this story touched you, share it with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment about what spoke to your heart, and subscribe for more stories of faith and redemption. May God watch over you, guide your steps, protect your loved ones, and fill your life with peace beyond the winter.